Mr Speaker, much as it is a great honour to speak before you in the House today, I was looking forward to the opportunity to add my congratulations to the new Speaker. And I will hold those congratulations because I have a particularly important message to pass on to him
Don't feel
in his role as new Speaker. But I would like to put on the record that it's an honour to speak before all of the speakers in this House today, and I'm looking forward to speaking before the new Mr Assistant Speaker as well. Speaking to the Auditor Regulation and External Reporting Bill in its second reading, and there's one thing about the Commerce Select Committee: we do a pretty good job, and we have robust discussion, and we thrash the issues through, and ultimately I believe that we're all committed to good law. And this bill is supported by the Labour Party, and one of the core reasons why it's supported by the Labour Party is because it's part of that important financial markets reform process that was begun under the Labour government. And I do need to put that on the record, because while it is important also to acknowledge the good work being done by the Minister in this area around the whole package of financial reforms, that they really do flow from important work that was done under the previous Labour government, and largely under the auspices of the previous Minister, the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, who happens to be the chair of the Commerce Select Committee. So I think the point of that is that ultimately what you are seeing is a commitment on both sides of the House to good law being made in this area. As my colleague David Parker pointed out, we do, however, retain some concerns with this bill and with the way that this package of bills is being introduced. And I'm going to touch on one of those matters in a minute, which has been mentioned by both previous speakers around the limitations on liability. But essentially this bill, and I also would like to endorse what my colleague David Parker said around the systemic issues around complexity of the financial accounting issues that emerge right throughout these reforms, that underline these reforms and underline what some of the reasons for the need for the reforms is because the areas are so complex and so dense that the ordinary person out there, particularly people who are investors, have great difficulty in understanding. And financial literacy, and this has been brought to the attention of the Minister on a number of occasions, that the issues around financial literacy are critical and they need to be addressed, and they're not being addressed by this government as we see it. But speaking to this bill, it strengthens the regulation of practitioners who carry out the audits of issuers, reconstitutes the Accounting Standards Review Board as the external reporting board, and it requires the Institute of Chartered Accountants to regulate auditors as a specialist profession rather than chartered accountants. And as I think the Minister pointed out in her opening speech, that it really is about registration of auditing firms, and that it's really strengthening the regulatory and legislative remedies for around this whole area. We support this bill ultimately because we want to restore confidence in New Zealand's financial markets. It's been through a wide consultation period. There were a number of submissions to the Select Committee, and I'm going to touch on a couple of areas quickly around liability, and initially around the liability of partners issue, because through the Select Committee process there were two areas around this that we touched on and have commented on in the commentary to the bill. Under the current Act, all partners of an audit firm would be liable if the firm breached the relevant restriction. And the amendment proposed by the Select Committee meant that a partner would commit an offence only if the relevant breach took place with his or her authority and permission or consent if he or she could have reasonably known that the breach was going to be committed and failed to take reasonable steps to prevent it. So we considered that under the clause 8.5 of the bill as introduced, every partner of an audit firm would have been committing an offence if the firm breached the relevant restriction, and we considered that larger firms particularly would be disproportionately sanctioned by such a provision, which is why that particular change was brought in at the Select Committee stage. The second issue was around the limitations on liability, which both David Parker and my colleague on the Select Committee, Sam Botelgenga, has referred to around the limitations on liability. We considered carefully whether the bill should be expanded to introduce measures to limit auditors' liability, but we recommended back here no amendments to that effect, and that was ultimately because our conclusion was that, and the advice to us was that we had no scope for that under this particular bill. However, we put commentary in the commentary back to on the bill on this because we recognise that some form of liability limitation would harmonise New Zealand's system with international practice. And I just want to, and what we did was we asked for comprehensive advice from officials on this, and there are, and considered it quite carefully, around the jurisdictions that have adopted alternative liability systems and some of the approaches that have been adopted elsewhere. And I am keen, I know that the relevant minister isn't in the House, but I am keen for this for a response on this back from the minister on what if any views he has around this. I'm just going to quickly touch on the alternative approaches that have been adopted elsewhere, which there's 4 of them, Mr. Speaker. Incorporation being the first one, where companies and or limited liability partnerships are able to carry out audits in many jurisdictions, and those limited liability partnerships are an alternative corporate business vehicle that gives the benefits of limited liability but allows its members the flexibility to organise their internal structure as a traditional partnership. Then there's proportionate liability, where the court determines liability among the negligent parties according to their share of the blame, and this approach includes allowing the courts to have regard to the comparative responsibility of any wrongdoer who isn't a party to the proceedings. The third one is liability caps, which provide for the amount of liability to be capped at a multiple of the fee and or a fixed dollar amount in relation to any one cause of action. And then finally contractual to be accurate, restrictions on liability, and under that approach the auditor or the preparer may contractually agree to a restriction in liability. We looked at a number of jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker, including Australia, the United Kingdom, Singapore and Hong Kong, where auditor liability reform has been and still is being considered internationally, and some, such as Australia, have settled policies and laws, and we could do well to look carefully at that, and which is why we were considering the issue of harmonisation. Others, such as the United Kingdom, have implemented reforms and are now evaluating their performance, and still others, such as Singapore and Hong Kong, are identifying issues with their current regimes and are still beginning to consider possible reforms. In our commentary, we did say, when we concluded, that while such an amendment around this would be outside the scope of the bill, we asked to see this issue addressed in the Border Scope Review of Securities Law, which the member across the House has referred to before. And we in particular believe that consideration should be given to amending the Securities Act and replacing auditors' current exposure to joint and several liability with alternative systems such as proportionate or capped liability. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.